Hey everybody, I'm Mike Settele, founder of Settele Tutoring, and this is the 9th episode of my 10-part series on the strategies for the digital SAT. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the grammar rules the most important ones that you need to know for the test. I won't be able to talk about everything though, so make sure that you subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss the videos that I release about those other extra rules. Plus, I've already done tons of grammar videos for the past versions of the SAT that you can use to study for the new digital version as well. So if you're on my channel, you'll always be aware of new videos and new lessons that come out. But let's just dive into what we're going to talk about today. As you can see from this little chart here, we have a lot of questions that are covered by grammar rules. So about 24% of the test, and specifically questions about sentence structure account for 15% of the reading section. That is a lot of points. That's a lot of questions, 8 per test, where basically if you know the punctuation rules and you know how to build a sentence, you're going to be able to earn some pretty consistent points. And that's because even though the questions are obviously going to change from test to test, the rules don't change. So we're able to kind of apply the same process again and again and again. So for many of you, this is an easy way to improve your score and guarantee a good chunk of points. Like I said, there are some other rules that I won't get to in this lesson about singular and plural verbs and pronouns, modifiers, and the tense questions about past, present, future, but we will cover those in any video where they come up for the practice test. So if you want to just add those in, the best way to do it is to take some practice tests, use my videos to review. Anytime they come up in a question, I will do a quick review of the rule in the video. But for now, let's talk about what sentence structure really means here. So you can see at the top here, most questions, as I said, are about sentence structure. Complete sentences have a subject and a verb. This is kind of like a definitional thing in English grammar. Fragments, or extra clauses, are going to be attached to sentences with punctuation. Either they're attached at the beginning or the end using usually commas, or we insert some sort of extra clause into the middle of a sentence. And there are also ways of joining sentences together. We're going to try to talk about all of that. But as I do, I'm going to try to avoid being too grammatical about things. I think that that's a mistake that a lot of people make when they are trying to study for the grammar portion here, is they get into things like past participles and objects of the preposition. You really shouldn't have to know that level of detail to do well here. Most of what we're talking about is something that you should kind of train yourself to hear. You want to be able to very quickly hear the difference between a complete sentence and a fragment or an extra clause. So we're going to use this passage here to try to do that a little bit, and with more practice, with practice tests, you will get better and better at honing that skill. So it is something that should be instinctual. You really shouldn't be like a grammarian, like kind of combing through a sentence here. As much as possible, you want to just feel it out. So let's just review the question first of all. This is the same question you'll get for every single grammar question. Which choice completes the text so that it conforms to the conventions of standard English? And of course, we have 4 options and a blank. Now, when I read the sentence, I'm usually just going to take choice A and put it into the blank so that I can try to make sense of what's going on. Some of you may prefer to read it as the word blank, but I think that kind of disrupts the flow of what's going on. So I usually just pick a choice and just make that like the standard and then compare it as I start to dissect the sentence. So here, what we're going to do is every time we hit a punctuation mark, we're going to try to analyze what we just read and see like, okay, was that a sentence? Was that a fragment? How does it relate to everything that's going on? So this first part, throughout the 1930s, hopefully you hear that that is not a complete sentence. That's an intro clause. It's clearly leading us into something that could not stand alone as a sentence if we put a period after 1930s. So that piece is a fragment. It's an intro clause. Let's continue. Coco Azure set numerous records as a female aviator. That is a sentence, even without the part that came before it. Even without anything that comes after it. That could be a sentence. We could start with Coco, we could end with aviator, and we could put a period there if we wanted. Now, I know that that's choice B, but we don't know that that's the right answer necessarily yet. I just highlighted this to show this is what a sentence sounds like. It does have a subject and a verb. The subject here is Coco Azure. The verb is set, so a verb is an action, and a subject is the thing that does the action. So Coco is setting the records. There's our sentence. So now we have to continue and think, what are these extra clauses doing? Where else are we kind of moving through ideas in a sentence versus fragment kind of way? So continuing on. Having learned to fly with the support of her father. That's not a sentence. We do kind of have a verb, this ing verb, which we'll talk about later in more detail, but we don't have a real subject here. We're talking about Coco still, but we don't mention her in that piece. So this is technically not a sentence. And again, hopefully even without all that grammatical kind of picking it apart, we can just hear that it feels incomplete. It feels like it's leading into something or it's following from something, but it couldn't stand on its own. Next part. The famed aeronautical engineer Benjamin Marigold Parkinson. Well, that's just a long way of talking about a guy. There's no action there, so there's no sentence there either. She won multiple air races across the United States. That's also a sentence. It's a separate sentence. She is the subject, won is the verb, the rest is detail, but it's still something that could stand on its own with a capital S in front of she and a period after states. We could do that if we wanted to. Let's finish it up. Most notably, the 1935 American Cup race between New York City and San Francisco. This is just description. It's telling us about the race, but it's not itself a sentence. It's also a fragment. So the two pieces that I've highlighted here are complete sentences that could stand on their own. Everything that's not highlighted is an extra clause that's either interrupting or kind of getting attached using commas. And so we need to think about what would be a valid way to have two complete sentences in one sentence. Because as you can see here, they've only given us a period at the end of all this. So our choice is, do we want to add another one? And basically the answer is yes. That's the only valid way to have two sentences with the options that we're given. So let's talk about why. What's going on here? Well, if we did choose choice A, that would involve a comma connecting the two sentences. And sometimes there are ways we can do this, but by itself, a comma is a weak punctuation mark. It is not capable of just joining two complete sentences together. So even though there's a bunch of other clauses in between, we kind of just by the fact we've identified two complete sentences know that we need a stronger punctuation mark to be able to separate those things. A comma by itself is not going to do it. What a comma generally does is it shows us where the structure of a sentence is breaking. So we do have these kind of transitions, these extra clauses, but it's not enough to join two sentences. What we really would have in choice A is a run-on sentence, and that is not good. So this is why we need to be able to identify complete sentences, because we need to know whether or not certain punctuation marks are going to work. The other piece, though, that kind of complicates this is choice C, which has the same words, but then adds in another one, the word and, which is a conjunction. And you might have heard this grammatical term before. Maybe you've heard the little acronym fanboys, but the conjunctions that really matter are and, but, or, and so. And what a conjunction does in terms of sentence structure is it does let us join two sentences together with a comma. So by itself, it's not going to be enough to join the sentences, and that's the problem with choice C, is it doesn't have the comma. If there was a comma before that and, then we're okay. Then we can use it to join the two sentences maybe, but by itself it's not okay. So it's kind of a half measure. And that's why so many of these questions are really going to, at the end of the day, even though they look like they're about punctuation, they're really about sentence structure. What is the appropriate punctuation to join two sentences, to add a sentence to a clause, things like that. So let's look at some more examples, because like I said, this is not something I want to get too grammatical about. It's something that you kind of learn through doing, and you build this kind of a sense about whether or not something is a sentence or not. So with number 2, it's the same question. We can tell by the answer choices that we have punctuation choices to make. So let's take a look at the first piece here. Iodine deficiency has been a notable problem throughout human history because the element is rare in many geographic areas. That's a sentence, especially those far from seacoasts. That's a fragment that we're adding on with a comma, but because it ends with a period there, I'm just going to ignore all of this, because the next part, where I do need to still think about sentence structure, is kind of reset by the fact that it's a new sentence. So this piece that I've highlighted here doesn't really matter. It's not going to affect the sentence structure of the next sentence. So I don't know why they give us a couple extra sentences sometimes, but just know when you can ignore them here. It doesn't matter. It's not going to affect it. So let's keep going. When added to table salt, well, that's a fragment. It's leading into something. However, that's just a little bit of an interruption there. Iodine becomes a much more common nutrient. That's a sentence. That could stand on its own. Just listen to it. Iodine becomes a much more common nutrient. Everything that came before it is really helpful for us understanding a larger point, but grammatically it's not necessary. Just that yellow highlighting is necessary for us to have a complete sentence. Then again, I'm assuming choice A is correct here, but we don't know yet. Let's take a look at the next piece that comma would separate out. The recommended daily value, easily attainable by eating modest portions of most recipes. Well, here some of you are probably going to have trouble knowing whether or not that's a sentence. Like, we definitely seem to have some verbs maybe, like attain, attainable, or eating. Like, are those verbs? And then what's the subject? Is it the daily value? So if you're thinking grammatically, you might have trouble here. But let's take a look at the answer choices. We can use some strategy to make better sense of this without having to rely too much on grammar. The thing that I noticed first is choice C, which has a semicolon. And we need to know the rules for these advanced punctuation marks because they are actually much more predictable than the rules for something like a comma, which has a lot of different rules attached to it. Semicolons really just have two, and the one we're going to focus on here is in this little chart. It separates two complete sentences. So in other words, a semicolon is the exact same thing as a period. You have a sentence before it, you have a sentence after it. The only difference is the semicolon is not going to have a new capital letter after the semicolon, but it's functioning the same way as a period. And if we look at our choices here, we can see choice D is the exact same thing as choice C, except instead of having a semicolon, it has a period. So functionally, those two choices are exactly the same. And this is a real strategy we can use. In most cases, if you've got a semicolon and a period as answer choices without any words changing, you can cross them both out. They're the same thing, so they cannot both be right. Now, I should say that there is one other use of a semicolon. I do talk about it in another video where I get more detailed about semicolons. That's going to be in the description, and that's why you should subscribe. So when I do those other videos, you get the little extra pieces of all these rules. But for now, that is enough to now have a 50-50 chance. And if we look at choice B, it does have that conjunction and that we talked about before. And this time it does have a comma, which would be a valid way to connect two sentences. But since C and D were also ways of joining two sentences and those were wrong, then B is probably wrong as well because it would functionally do the exact same thing. So what must be going on here is that the second part isn't a complete sentence, and so choice A is a valid way to connect these parts because a comma is being used just to attach an extra clause to the end of that yellow highlighted sentence there. This, again, may feel very confusing. I don't want to get too much into the grammar, but I will give you an alternative to that ending part that might help you hear the difference between something being a sentence and something not being a sentence. So as it's written, it is not a sentence. There's technically no verb here. Let me read it. The recommended daily value, easily attainable by eating modest portions of most recipes. This is description. But by adding the word is, I can turn it into a sentence. Listen. The recommended daily value is easily attainable by eating modest portions of most recipes. Is a verb. So technically, if we add that in there in the right spot, we've now turned it into a sentence. And if we did have that word is there, then A would be wrong because the comma by itself is not enough to join that to the other sentence that exists before it. So we would need something like B, C, or D to do that. And all of them would be equally valid. And so this is why commas are so annoying. There's just a lot of different rules and it's kind of hard to hear what's going on. But as we'll see, these more advanced punctuation marks are way more predictable. So those are things that you should kind of gravitate towards as soon as you see them in answer choices. They have set rules that we can follow and we can look for sentences and fragments very easily. Let's move on to another question. This one might be harder to judge what's going on because if we look at the answer choices, there's no punctuation going on. So you might think, oh, is it just about verb tense? And in a way it is, but a lot of times when they're testing verb tense, it's still affecting the sentence structure. Certain verbs can be used in certain places to either make something a sentence or to make it a fragment. So we have to think about that. So as I'm reading, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to think about where do I have fragments, where do I have sentences? Building on several unsuccessful experiments conducted by others. That's a fragment. The comma is letting us attach that fragment to the main sentence. We're leading into the main sentence. Biologists Seymour Mulligan, Yvonne Slapp. Okay, now we have a dash. We haven't seen that before, but I can tell we're kind of starting the sentence. So what does a dash do? In this case, because we have two dashes, we are using them to interrupt our sentence and insert some information into the middle of it. So sometimes we have a complete sentence, but it's broken apart by some sort of interruption, either with commas or with dashes. We can also use a single dash to kind of add something onto the end of the sentence. So you will see that on the SAT, but here we're using the double dash as an interruption. So we can kind of listen and hear that it's not itself a sentence either. founders of the world-famous Victoria Institute for Exotic Diseases. It's kind of like just a description. So what we should do is ignore that part and kind of pick up where we left off. Biologists Seymour Mulligan and Yvonne Slapp discovered and then synthesized an artificial version of the marsupial enzyme bryoveronase to produce nerve-repairing compounds on an industrial scale previously considered impossible. Well, there's no other commas here, so there's no other break that we can kind of think of, and that's what makes this difficult, is there's a lot of text to listen to and try to hear if it's a sentence. So what you could do with practice is, even when we don't have punctuation telling us that something is an extra piece, an extra clause, we can still kind of trim down a sentence a bit and find a little bit more of a core to listen to. So in this case, there are some prepositional phrases and other things that would kind of let me ignore stuff. I would get rid of that middle piece there, I get rid of the end, and I have like a more condensed version of the sentence. Biologists Seymour Mulligan and Yvonne Slapp discovered and then synthesized an artificial version to produce nerve-repairing compounds. That sounds like a sentence. So does B. Biologists Seymour Mulligan and Yvonne Slapp discovered and then synthesized an artificial version producing nerve-repairing compounds. That also sounds fine to me, but if we did C and D, they would not work. I'm not going to read them. I think you can do that on your own, but both C and D would sound weird if we put them in there. But both A and B I do think sound okay, and this is where verb tense gets tricky. The real issue is that choice B has an ing verb, okay? There's lots of grammatical terms for these things, depending on how they're used. I'm not going to get into it, but basically, ing words are kind of like verbs, they're kind of like actions, but they're not strong enough, usually, to make a sentence on their own. Either we use them with a comma to kind of attach something to a sentence, to attach a fragment to a sentence, or we use them along with a helping verb, an is, are, be, were, was, those kinds of words to kind of strengthen them a bit and then turn them into actual sentences. So we can see the ing at work at the beginning of this sentence, right? Building on several unsuccessful experiments conducted by others. That's a very classic way of using ing words to kind of lead into something else or provide extra information without being a sentence on its own. And that's what would happen if we chose choice B. Producing nerve-repairing compounds would be this kind of extra clause. But in order to say that, we would need a comma before producing to attach it to the main sentence. So B sounds okay because when we talk, we don't say the punctuation marks. But as written, B is wrong because it's missing the comma that would let us grammatically attach that to the sentence. So because there's no punctuation change here, we've got to go with choice A. It's the only one that lets us continue this thought without the interruption that a comma or other punctuation mark would cause. I get that this is confusing. Again, with more practice, you will get better and better at seeing these patterns. I just wanted to talk about this question to kind of lump it in with the other ones we've been doing. A lot of people, it's very easy to recognize when they're testing punctuation, but this is kind of the same thing, even though there is no punctuation in the answer choices. So I want you to make that connection for now. Just know when sentence structure is being tested, might not always have that punctuation as an indicator. Let's do one more question as quickly as we can. Here we have a bunch of different ways of kind of breaking this Charles Dickens off from the rest. But the first thing I notice is choice C, where we have a colon. Okay, colons have very set rules, kind of like semicolons. We should go to those first because if they break that rule, we can quickly cross out that choice. For our purposes here, the first part before the colon must be a complete sentence that could stand on its own. The second part can be anything. Sometimes it's also a complete sentence. Sometimes it's a list. Sometimes it's just one word. But that first part has a set rule. So let's just try it out. Let's end the sentence where that colon is and see if it sounds complete. As was common at the time, famed author. Well, famed author what? What did he do? There's no verb there, so that's not a sentence. Therefore, C is definitely wrong. Now, looking at the rest, that first part is definitely an extra clause, as was common at the time, leading into something. Famed author Charles Dickens was paid to write by the word. That sounds like a sentence. We have the author, we have Charles Dickens, he was paid, right? So there's a verb there. So that is something that could stand on its own. We are attaching an extra clause at the end there, which explains why many of his novels are filled with long chapters that seem to be irrelevant to the plot. That is not a sentence, that is a fragment. The word which is the dead giveaway here. But what's really going on, if we look at the answer choices, we have D, where it's a continuous thought, no break, but both A and B are using commas and dashes to kind of chop this up in some ways. So what they're doing here is kind of similar to the double dash in the last question. They're inserting something. So if we're going to insert that as an interruption, in theory then it's not part of the main sentence. So we should be able to read the sentence without it and still have a sentence. So the test here is whether this can stand on its own without the name Charles Dickens. Let's read it without that. Famed author was paid to write by the word. That sounds bad to me. That is not enough. That feels like we're missing something. Maybe if we said the famed author was paid to write by the word, or a famed author was paid to write by the word. So the punctuation here is telling us to set the name Charles Dickens apart and say that that's extra, that that's not part of the sentence. But if we read it without that, it sounds like it's missing something important. Therefore, it is part of the sentence. Therefore, choice D is the only one that's going to make sense. What this is doing here is testing an idea called appositives. You definitely use this in your own writing. You've used it a lot of times with commas, which is why choice A is a little bit of a trap here. They know that you kind of know this rule, so they're giving you this option to kind of lure you in. And sometimes appositives do get commas, like in choice A, or even a little bit in choice B, but in not every case. So we have to be able to judge based on the circumstances, and the best way to do that is to do what we did. If you think it's unnecessary, cross it out, see how it sounds without it, and in this case it would fail that test, so we would know that we don't actually need commas to kind of add in this extra piece. And again, I don't want to get too grammatical, but just so you know, an appositive is kind of like when we have a noun or a subject and we're kind of referencing it in two different ways, right? Charles Dickens and famed author, right? That's two ways of kind of talking about the same thing. And so sometimes we use commas, sometimes we don't. In this case, it's more like famed author is his title, so we just want to lead right into his name. I will also say that there are traps sometimes with colons that you got to be careful of. For some reason, everyone has learned the rule that a colon is for lists. That is not really a rule. Most lists on the SAT will not have colons, and most colons on the SAT will not have lists. So there is another video that I put in my description that will help you with the colon rules, but it's another example of what's going on here, where they know that you kind of know some rule, and they're giving you a situation to take advantage of your kind of half knowledge of something. But all of this is, I know this is a lot, but hopefully it's a starting point to help you start to build towards those 8 or 13 questions that you really want to maximize your points on. These are an easy place where memorization and practice can get you some improvement on your score. So make sure that you are subscribing to my channel so that you don't miss other videos about the other rules. You get to practice these rules in more detail. I will always help you break a sentence down to talk about what the complete sentence is versus what the fragments are. So hopefully, with all of that reiteration, this will at some point become second nature to you. That's really how we want it to be. Oh, that's a lot. Thank you for watching. Thank you for getting through all that heavy grammar. And remember, when it comes to your scores, don't settle for less, settle for more.